Welcome, everyone, to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeff Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, which is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And today we take up one of the most hotly contested, richly illuminating and important questions in constitutional law, namely, does the U.S. Constitution or do state constitutions guarantee an equal education to every child? This is just about as important as it gets. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the U.S. Constitution does not guarantee an equal education because education is not a fundamental right, and the decision to fund schools based on property taxes does not discriminate on the basis of wealth. But in recent years, there have been a series of very interesting decisions from state courts interpreting their own state constitutions, holding the opposite, namely that some state constitutions do guarantee some kind of equal educational access. And there was a very interesting decision out of California recently holding that teacher tenure rules violate the equal educational rights guaranteed by the California Constitution. So what we have done for you is assemble a dream team of policy people and scholars and advocates on all sides of this important question. We are going to talk about the policy issues, we're going to talk about the constitutional issues, and we're going to hear from the superintendent of schools of Philadelphia about the state of the schools here in Philadelphia itself. I think it's going to be a remarkably rich afternoon of conversation. This is co-sponsored by our wonderful new partners at the Philadelphia Media Network. This has been a great partnership we've started, and two of our conversations will be moderated by Kristen Graham, who's a staff writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer, one of the greatest education writers in the city, and I'll introduce her in just a moment. So here's the run of show. First, we're going to have a policy discussion, bringing together the education policy experts from around the city, who I'll introduce in a moment, who will look at the state of Philadelphia public education, what an equal education in Philadelphia would look like, and their proposals for getting there. They'll also tell us what the Pennsylvania state constitution says about this question, and Kristen Graham will moderate. Then we're going to have a keynote conversation between Kristen and Dr. William Haidt, who's the superintendent of the school district of Philadelphia. And then I will moderate a conversation between the attorneys who argued this fascinating California case, who've honored us by coming from far on the West Coast to talk about this question. That's James Finberg and Joshua Lipschitz. They will give us the best arguments for and against the idea that the California Constitution protects a right of equal educational access. So you're in for a treat, and let me introduce the first panel. We will hear from Donna Cooper, Mark Gleason, Deborah Gordon Klehr, and Ina Lipman. Donna Cooper is Executive Director of Public Citizens for Children and Youth, a child advocacy organization that influences elected officials. Deborah Gordon Klehr is the Executive Director of the Education Law Center. Ina Lipman is Executive Director of the Children's Scholarship Fund. And our great moderator, Kristen Graham, is a staff writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And Mark Gleason is also here, and he is Executive Director at the Philadelphia Schools Partnership. Please join me in welcoming our first panelists. So glad you're here. Great. Welcome. What a great discussion. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you all for joining us, folks. Let's get right to it. The Pennsylvania State Constitution requires the provision of a thorough and efficient education. What exactly does thorough and efficient mean, and how do we measure it? Mark, I'll start with you.
Okay, sure. Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. So the Pennsylvania Constitution starts, as many constitutions do, with the principle of all men being entitled to certain rights. And we interpret the phrase all men to mean all people. So the spirit of the Constitution is that we are providing something that's going to apply to every person in the Commonwealth. The section of the Constitution where we see the phrase thorough and efficient education, I think what's especially significant about that phrase is the word that's not there. it ends with education. It doesn't end with education system. So the promise, the pledge of the Constitution of the Commonwealth is that we're going to provide a thorough and efficient education for every person. It doesn't mean the same way through the same system necessarily, but it means we're going to deliver something of value, something that's important to good citizenship, to every person. Thorough, of course, implies comprehensive, and efficient means we do have limited resources, so we have to be efficient in the way we deliver it. We have to be strategic in how we deliver on that promise of giving an education to every person.
Ina?
Good afternoon. I would agree with what Mark is saying. I would add that we want to create a system that has opportunities and provides the resources necessary to educate our children so that they can succeed. And it's really about, those words to me, it's about leveling the playing field so that every one of our children in this Commonwealth have access to a quality education.
Deborah?
I think it's important to talk about the actual words that are in it. It says, the General Assembly shall provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth. So the onus is on the General Assembly to create this system of public education. And we begin from the premise that this, the needs of the Commonwealth includes all children. So it's children with disabilities, English language learners, children experiencing homelessness, children in the foster care, juvenile justice system, children in poverty. And we really need to make sure that this system of public education is meeting the needs of all of our students. We don't need to define what thorough and efficient means because the State Board of Education and the Pennsylvania Department of Education have done that for us with, by implementing these specific content-based academic standards, saying that this is what our students need to meet. We have Keystone exams, we have PSSAs, and we can, the exams certainly have flaws, but in general the state has set these measurable benchmarks of what a thorough and efficient education means, and it's our job to ensure that our students have access to education to meet those needs.
Donna, what's your take?
Well, my take is that we have to understand what constitutions are, right? Constitutions are general language that express the intent of people who are creating the Commonwealth or creating the nation, right? And so just as we continue to argue about what does the Second Amendment mean, there's continued argument about what does the language in the Pennsylvania Constitution mean when it comes to a system of thorough and efficient education. And Mark's delineation of the word system shows that the argument still lives on. And that's healthy because when that Constitution was written, we didn't have primary school education universally available through 8th grade. And then in the 1800s, we began to say, oh, we need to go to school longer than that. So the idea of a constitution is to create a framework. And I think what we're struggling with here in Pennsylvania right now is that the rest of the world that we're competing with, mainly China and India, are increasingly delivering a high-quality education to larger and larger shares of their children through college. And we are still struggling to figure out how to do that past 8th grade. And so what that conversation about thorough and efficient that we're having today is, how do we live up to the framework of the meaning of thorough, meaning it's deep, it's available to all, and that it's delivered in a way that's cost-effective but not cheap. It doesn't say cheap. And I really think that's the conversation that we're having today, rather than what do these words mean abstractly, but how do we live this Constitution in 2015?
So as a follow-up to that, and Deborah sort of alluded to this in some way, how do you measure thorough and efficient? Deborah talked about the state standards, but are there other ways we can and should be measuring what thorough and efficient is?
You want to start again on this end?
Whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I'll start by saying, in addition to the measurable standards that our General Assembly and that our Department of Education and our State Board of Education have put forward, we've also measured how much it costs. So in 2007, we had a costing out study, Donna knows all about that, where we thought, well, where our legislature ordered this study to figure out how much does it cost to get our students to these state standards, what does it cost for each district, and take into account the types of students. So for students who are in deep poverty or English language learner students, what what are the different weights that we need to put onto what it costs to educate that child. So we've measured it. We just abandoned it in 2011, and we're hopeful that our General Assembly will bring that back for our students, for our schools.
I would say that we have to start to develop a system that is an accountable system. So it's not just saying the words that we'll have a thorough and efficient system, but we really have to look at what's happened in the last 40 years. We can really go back to Brown versus the Board of Education when we looked at equality as an issue, and what we still have is a de facto segregation, both economically and racially in Philadelphia, that really drives a lot of inequality. But the answers from the point of view of the courts now are really, it's a matter of state and local governments. And I think one of the most efficient things that we have in Pennsylvania are over 500 school districts. So I think you can begin with both local governance being dictated by, a little bit dictated by the state legislature, and trying to make the system more responsive, more efficient, probably by reducing the number of school districts, which is, I know, a political football, but really getting to how to level the playing field, and getting away from not requiring accountability in these systems. And I think in Philadelphia, we spent a lot of time post-Brown versus Board of Education trying to figure out what was the course of action. And in 1992, we had rulings by this courts saying that we can't get into de facto segregation, and we won't redraw the district lines. We want to look at programs and really beef up all the programs. If you look at the language, the long and short of it is we're still basically in the same boat in terms of our delivery systems, and we really, I think, to get to the efficiency and to get to the equity, need to really broaden how we define opportunity.
I would add that I think that the terms thorough and efficient are both an equation and they're relative. Meaning there isn't a set definition for thorough and efficient, and the Constitution doesn't expect us to examine them in isolation, but together. So when I think about that now in 2015, I want thorough and efficient to mean that I am doing as well as Massachusetts, the top performing state, for the children that live in the Commonwealth, because in fact their Constitution has very similar language. And what they have is a system that actually puts resources behind their public education system. They have a system that has much more higher expectations on their teacher training programs. They have a system that is more robust in terms of principal leadership and is more accountable than our system. But so I think, again, this idea of how do we measure it, I want to measure it, I want to be the top contender. I want my kids in my state to be better than any kid in America. And that maybe would have been what the Pennsylvania founders wanted, maybe not, but let's say they do now. And we need to measure ourselves against the others who are doing better than us with very similarly worded constitutions, and they are making substantially more investments per child, and they are also spending those funds wisely in the system of education, both how they train teachers in pre-K, in strong early learning, in doing the basics right so the kids that are getting a better shot in life.
Mark, any thoughts to add?
I'll just connect the last 2 points. In Pennsylvania, we have a funding system for education that has created wide disparities. So we're one of the states with the biggest gap between the dollars that flow to more affluent communities versus the dollars that flow to less affluent communities. And that underscores the need to when we're talking about measurement of thorough and efficient, we're talking about it 2 ways. We're talking about how are we doing overall? How is the state doing? How are all of the kids together doing? But also, how are we doing inside that in terms of comparing different student populations to one another and their success? Because we have a long way to go in that regard. And until 30 years ago, and really until 15 years ago with No Child Left Behind, we weren't diving deeply into understanding the differences in the delivery of thorough and efficient by different student populations within the larger group.
So let's talk specifics. Is our educational system giving kids in Philadelphia a thorough and efficient education? What are the barriers to thorough and efficient here, and how do we overcome them? Who wants to lead off?
Go ahead, Deborah.
Okay. We're not providing a system of thorough and efficient education to our students in Philadelphia, and part of that is because we are woefully underfunded. We are woefully underfunded. We're still underfunded. Mark alluded to this. Pennsylvania has the largest gap between the wealthiest and the poorest school districts. And Philadelphia, I mentioned this before, 2011, the state sustained just under $1 billion in education cuts. And Philadelphia still hasn't been made whole. There's still $300 million in money that hasn't been given back to the school district. And as a result, we're not able to provide the education that our students deserve and, in fact, are legally entitled to. So we've got crumbling schools. We've got very few school nurses, an inadequate number of school guidance counselors, not to mention large class sizes and teachers who don't have opportunities to have all of the training that we need. We're moving somewhat in the right direction with some recent improvements to not using school police as school disciplinarians and doing some better around not criminalizing our students inappropriately here in Philadelphia. But I think statewide and especially in Philadelphia, we're not able to provide a thorough and efficient education to our students, and a big reason for that is inadequate funding.
Yeah, I would concur that I don't think anybody in this audience is there anybody in the audience that would raise their hands and say we're delivering a thorough and efficient education system to kids in Philly? The answer would be no. I think the one question is who has the obligation? What obligation is there on the state since it's in the Constitution? And heretofore, the legislature, obviously since 2011, has been unwilling to even think about the words thorough and efficient. So they have basically said, well, it's really not our responsibility. We can do a $1 billion cut. We were spending more than ever before, regardless of whether more was the right term or not. So I don't think that there's a lot of viewed differently. I don't think people disagree that the system is not working. I think that the challenge is that if the legislature were to put more resources on the table for the Philadelphia School District, would we in Philly back the right decisions to make sure that that money was used well? Would that money be used to create competitive teacher salaries, to ensure universal pre-K, to ensure that teachers were well trained so they can do what's necessary with children who come in who don't even know colors when they enter their school. They don't know their siblings' ages when they enter school. They're so far behind. And so we expect a system to catch children up when we have such an extraordinary 78% of our kids in poverty entering the doors every day. And I think that's really the question. Are we thorough and efficient in that regard, given the nature of the children coming?
I'll build on that, and just at the risk of being the naysayer here, want to point out that resources is part of why it's one of the barriers to thorough and efficient in Philadelphia, but there's a complicated web of things that all have to work together. So a couple of data points. Last year, a new cigarette tax went into effect in Philadelphia. That was worth about $70 million in new revenue to schools here in the city. Within 2 years, that entire $70 million will only be enough to cover the increasing cost of pensions for the school district of Philadelphia. So it won't actually go into creating new teachers or new resources, new technology for the classroom. Now, why is that? Because of decisions that were made 10, 20 years ago at the legislative level in terms of not funding the pension system. The other piece, though, is it's not even as simple as fixing the pension system or funding the pension system, because the pension system itself isn't aligning to the goal of thorough and efficient education. So Pennsylvania's pension system is not a financial inducement to young teachers, because to benefit from the Pennsylvania pension system as a teacher, you really need to stay in the system for a full 25 years or longer. Almost all of the benefits go to people who've been in the system for that length of duration. And so we have a pension system fundamentally that's not good at attracting and retaining young teachers in the profession who might only want to teach 15 years or 20 years. So it's not delivering on the promise of a great educator in every classroom. And then on top of that, we haven't funded it, and now it's sucking money that could be going into classrooms and other benefits for kids. So when we talk about resources, we have to be careful to not just focus on those, because there are a whole lot of policy decisions and conversations we have to be having about how those resources get deployed that are also just as, if not more important.
Ina?
I concur with what Mark is saying and Donna. One, we do need to fund these schools better in Philadelphia. when you look at suburban districts and you look at the issues that we face in Philadelphia, you're talking about two different populations of children. And in Philadelphia, you really have a high need population. That does require more resourcing. It requires probably smaller class sizes than exist in the suburban schools to really effectively educate children. But it's not simply a matter of money. And I certainly date back to all the different initiatives. I cut my teeth at Children Achieving, and I watched the flow of money into the endless pot and didn't see it move the needle forward for children, even though there was great promise and great hope and a lot of good rhetoric. We have to do some of the political hard work in this city. It's not just a state responsibility, and the courts have said it's a shared responsibility that's not well defined in the Constitution. We have to do some of the hard work in our city to really dial it forward for these children, and that includes looking at the current configuration of schools, see where our assets are, see where we can have economies. We started to close down half-filled schools. It's tough, it's really disruptive, but if done properly, you really can end up hiring more teachers and really managing the system better so that the money is going where it should be, which is in the classroom.
So let's put on our fixer hats. What will your specific proposals be for getting to thorough and efficient for Philadelphia's kids? We've alluded to that some, but I'd love to hear ideas.
Well, I think the first thing I would do, and this may not be very popular in this room, which is to separate the conversation from pensions from funding public schools. The history of pensions and public pensions starts from a whole different place than the Basic Education Act. And they have a confluence at the schools because these are public employees and because of political transactions that have been made over the last 90 years to create the public pension system. And there's pros and cons of that system. In fact, I think America will be better off as the baby boomers age because we have a public retirement system. And imagine if we didn't, the level of poverty among senior citizens. But that's an entirely different conversation. And one of the challenges that we have right now is that the legislature is in a pitched battle about whether they will change the pension system rather than how will they solve the school funding crisis in this state. So the first thing I would do is recognize there are two historical constructs. We're here today around thorough and efficient, and it's unfortunate that school funding resources locally are going to fund the pension that need to go into the classroom, but we shouldn't be having that generational debate at this point. Because what it is doing is causing the gray hairs to win and the children to lose. Because just by virtue of the fact of who votes, that's how it's going to play out. So it's a dangerous conversation, I think. That's the first thing. The second thing I would do is that I think it's, given the rising poverty in this city, it is essential that we change the terms for when kids start school. It is the most efficient place to invest, according to any economist that has looked at this. If we can get kids ready to start school reading, they're going to do better on the long term. So I would be focusing new state money that comes in, because we need new state money to come in, on universal pre-K and improving reading instruction and decreasing reading class size in elementary schools. So by the time kids enter their lifelong learning system, they have the fundamentals needed to be successful.
Who wants to jump in next?
I agree with those recommendations. And what other things should we be doing? I think we need to be creating more entrepreneurial, more space for entrepreneurs within education. We're still fundamentally educating kids the same way in 2015 that we did 70, 80 years ago. The world has changed enormously. What we need kids to learn and be prepared to do as they enter college and careers has changed enormously. It's hard to innovate in a system that's struggling in so many ways, but we have to figure out ways to innovate. One thing we have to do, in my opinion, we have to push the resources down to the local level. Think about this. I was with some people from Delaware recently. The entire state of Delaware is smaller than the city of Philadelphia. So when we talk about Philadelphia as one school district or one system, it's enormously large and complex compared to most of the districts across the state of Pennsylvania. And we have to recognize that going in. It's very hard to manage it as one thing. We've seen success in pockets, isolated pockets at the school level, in networks of schools. And so we need to push resources down and decision-making down to a school level, where school leaders can make decisions that are aligned to the needs of a particular student population, a particular neighborhood. One way to do that is student-based funding. So, as many of you know, the state is currently weighing whether to implement a weighted student funding formula for how to flow money to districts. That's a very positive step. Most states already have a system like that. We need one in Pennsylvania. But we need to go a step further once we do that and take a student-based funding formula down to the school level. So once the money comes into the city of Philadelphia, we should also be allocating it amongst the schools in the city on a student-weighted basis, so that, because there are schools within the same city that have very different student populations, very different needs, and need to spend their money differently, but in a centrally managed, enormous system that's bigger than the state of Rhode Island, that's bigger than the state of Delaware, it's very hard to do that effectively. So one of the ways to get to more thorough and more efficient is to push decision-making and dollars down to the school level.
Ina?
I agree. I think it's very fundamental that we utilize our social capital in Philadelphia. And it's in a similar vein to what Mark is saying. We have to be driven from the bottom up to really have meaningful reform and meaningful outcomes, which means that families and the schools and the communities that these kids are drawn from really take ownership and are involved. And this won't happen with a system that's almost too big to succeed. And at this point, it's an enormous job. And the Philadelphia School District, the way it's layered, it's very hard to understand and appreciate for anybody. Even the Pope that was just recently here, what are the issues on the ground happening at the schools, and really get to them effectively. And I guess my ideal system would be opening up many more opportunities for children and families to choose the school that really fits their child's needs. And you see that with the public charter schools as an option, and you've seen a shift in where families want to locate themselves, and that has had many positives because the families have had that ownership and they've become active stakeholders. I've seen it at Children's Scholarship Fund when families are not facing the desperation that we all have faced at times, and you know, some of us made decisions based on our own personal economics to unfortunately leave the city so that we could educate our kids. Well, a parent is a parent is a parent, and the ability to educate your child, whether you're rich or poor, is paramount, and we need to provide meaningful options to families, not 6 years from now, not 10 years from now, but now. And I think as a person who lived through Brown versus the Board of Ed, lived through Children Achieving, lived through the promise that I guess I forget what the acronym that Arlene Ackerman had used.
Imagine 2014.
Imagine 2014. Enough is enough. I mean, these kids are suffering, and what I see on a daily basis is the urgency. So part of my whole thing is we all have to feel the urgency, and we all have to look at varying models to get to the common good.
Deborah?
Well, I would be remiss if the day before an election I didn't mention that a big piece of the solution has to do with the courts recognizing that they have a role to play in interpreting the state constitution, and specifically interpreting the thorough and efficient, the education clause, and the courts recognizing that right now the Pennsylvania Supreme Court recognizing that it has a responsibility in interpreting what thorough and efficient means. So the Education Law Center, along with the Public Interest Law Center and a pro bono partner, we have filed a lawsuit against the state for failure to fund our schools. And we filed it under the state constitution's Equal Protection Clause and the state constitution's Education Clause. And so I hope that you all vote tomorrow. But I'm a 501c3, so I'm not telling you who to vote for. Just vote. For judges whose job it will be to decide whether or not they want to interpret the Education Clause of the state constitution. So sitting in this Constitution Center, I think we have to recognize that plays a really big, important role in solving the crisis in Philadelphia, is getting a statewide decision that there's meaning to that clause in our state constitution.
Great. To what extent do we already have school choice in Philadelphia? How much more do we need? And how accessible are the choices we have to different populations in the city?
I'll jump on that one. I'm really very optimistic, despite my earlier words, that we are at a great moment in Philadelphia. I started off with Children Achieving in 1996, and with systems that were really sluggish. I became part of Children's Scholarship Fund in 2001. Systems were still sluggish. We had hope with Paul Vallis. What I've seen in the last 15 years is nothing short of extraordinary in Philadelphia, and we're really on the cutting edge in the nation as to offering a wide variety of successful models in this city. And I think we've reached a tipping point in terms of having really good quality charters that have proven that these kids, despite their economic situation, can succeed and flourish and really reach their potential. We've seen it in the schools that serve our children, which are in the neighborhoods. There are about 150 schools that serve low-income children. Our families have an average income of $29,000. And we've seen it in some of the better models that are happening in the public system. And what we're also seeing are partnerships and a lack of egos among the leaders that are present here and in education that say the goal is to educate kids, and it doesn't matter how we do it, we just have to do it, and it's happening now.
I agree with the progress of the last 10 or 15 years. The state of school choice in Philadelphia, we absolutely have school choice in Philadelphia, and we've had it for many, many decades. The problem is there's not equal access to that choice. So we have magnet schools that are run by the school district that are largely white and largely Asian, underrepresentation by Black and Hispanic students and low-income students. We have neighborhood schools in Philadelphia that are the same. We think of them as neighborhood schools. Every kid in the neighborhood gets to go, but the reality is real estate costs drive who gets to choose those schools. So in schools like Meredith, McCall, Greenfield, to be able to live in that catchment area and send your kids automatically to that school requires your ability to pay $500,000, $600,000, $800,000 for a home. We looked this up today. The Penn Alexander catchment area, the homes within that catchment area sell for, on average, $300,000 to $400,000 more than the homes just 10 blocks to the west that are outside that catchment area. So there are families benefiting from choice through the way real estate taxes work and catchment areas work. We have charter schools that have leveled the playing field in many respects. Most charters in this city serve more low-income and more minority students. But even so, there are barriers in the charter sector in various ways that still don't completely level the playing field. We have private schools. Clearly, because tuition is charged, that's not a level playing field. Ina's organization does a lot to try to level that playing field. But what we have here is we have a city where, to families who can afford it, who can live in the right zip code, they have almost unlimited choice. And to families who don't live in the right zip code and whose color of their skin is different, in many cases, too many cases, their choices are limited. And that's where we're really falling short on the promise of thorough and efficient.
Yeah, I guess I think that I wish that choice was a strategy for success. I wish I was optimistic like Ina, because I'm actually an optimist by nature. But I don't think that creating new choice has demonstrated significant academic progress for children who are very poor and for those who are African American or Latino. And so I think that we've kind of tried that one. We've tried the choice, because I think Mark's right. We've had choice in Philly for a long time with the magnets and the citywide admission schools. And they also haven't changed the terms for the kids that aren't in those buildings. Just like charters haven't changed the terms for some kids in charters or the kids not in those buildings. And what I do remember from the Children Achieving days is when we didn't have full-day kindergarten, and we instituted full-day kindergarten with new city funds, and those kids, the progress of those kids by third grade was markedly better for every child, not just some, because it happened in every school, as a result of the institution of full-day kindergarten, which was one of the Imagine 2014 planks. Imagine 2014 had 10 planks. Only one was ever resourced. There was some Annenberg money that went into certain places, but again, it didn't universally become available to every kid. And with 200,000 kids, you got to do it universally, or you don't move the needle, not simply because there's so many kids, but because 30% of those families move during the academic year. So you really, to move the needle in Philadelphia, if innovation was translatable, because I really think schools succeed because of leaders more than the way things happen in them, if it was translatable, we would have been able to translate it already. But we just haven't seen enough strategies that can be applied system-wide so that all boats rise, not just some kids. And creating more choice is at the expense of the kids who don't have those. And that's why we need to look at universal options.
So I agree with Donna, and I would just point out that at the Education Law Center, we receive a lot of phone calls from parents of students who face these enrollment barriers when they're trying to exercise choice. So we have 200,000 public school students in Philadelphia. A third of them are in charter schools, but here's who's not in those charter schools. We have calls from a lot of, we know that English language learners are underrepresented, students in the child welfare and juvenile justice system, children experiencing homelessness are not able to access those choices, and students with disabilities who have higher needs, disabilities are not able to access those choices. They face enrollment barriers, and then sometimes once they are enrolled, they're pushed out. So we see it from individual families every day who call our office unable to access those choices.
I would just push back a little on the data. There is a ton of data showing a higher graduation rate for minority students, higher college-going rate for minority students, other metrics where we've seen improvement for minority students. We have a tremendously long way to go, and it is still a very unlevel playing field, but I think there's lots of evidence in Philadelphia that choice has created opportunity for some students. Does it cause stress on the larger system? Absolutely. We haven't gotten that mix right, but to go backward is what I fear, because going backward is going back to a system where really a very limited pool of people get the choice, and everybody else has to take what's left over.
And I would just like to add that equity doesn't, you want to be fair in your systems, but to have to wait till all boats can float is really not fair to the kids that are sinking and at risk. And if in our organization, and I also disagree with the testing, we've been measuring the impact of giving out scholarships to low-income children so that they can have an opportunity to get into a school today and not have to wait till, maybe another 20 years that we can figure out equity for everybody and make it, so everyone's at a higher level. We all are striving for that, and we're all working towards that, but in the meantime, we have a bunch of kids whose families are frantic. And if we can help as many kids as possible, it's not hurting the kids we leave behind. We leave behind kids routinely. Those of us with financial means. I left behind Philadelphia. I moved out of Pelton Village and raised my kids and took them to public schools in the suburbs. We see politicians every day saying that it's a personal decision why their kid is not in the public school, in a private school. This insults me because we have to personalize this, and we have to make it about our children, and we have to consider these Philadelphia kids that are in a system that has not measured up for so many years, that if we can help some of them, we're not going to turn our backs till we have complete equality and equity. That could be another 15, 20 years.
But Ina, it wouldn't be if, it wouldn't be, here is what I think is the bedrock statistic of this argument, which is Lower Merion spends twice the amount per child than Philadelphia to educate the children. And they get twice the benefit, meaning their children do 2 times better than ours. They have a 90% success rate in high school. We have a 45% success rate. We spend 50% of the money. So, and we actually have a little bit higher productivity than Lower Merion, because if Lower Merion had our per student expenditure and our students, they may do worse than us. Meaning the question of how a school district with 80% of its kids in poverty is supposed to get the same results as Lower Merion with 50% of the funds is really the question. We can create pockets of success where tremendous leaders like Scott Gordon, who runs Mastery, can succeed against odds. But that is not a universal answer, and there is every kid here. And it is not that money alone solves the problem, but without it, you can't really start to solve it for every kid.
So our time is running a little short, so we'll go through one last question before we take some questions from the audience. Along those same lines, how does or doesn't the notion of school choice meet the state's constitutional charge to provide a thorough and efficient system of funding for public education? And since choices can't be unlimited, does the notion of offering choice systematically mean that some get the choice they want while others don't? And what does it mean to offer families choice in this system of deregulation? Sorry, there's a lot there.
I'll take the first part of that.
Okay,
Kristen,
go for it.
Which is that the state constitution doesn't say anything about school choice. It talks about creating a system, maintaining a system of thorough and efficient education. And so that's our job, to create systemic solutions, not picking out a couple of kids to give them choices or only to give choice to certain students who are not our vulnerable student populations, but to create a system that's meeting the needs for all our students. And so I really see that as our charge.
I would build on that and say, if the charge is to build a system that delivers thorough and efficient for every child, and we have 50 years of experience with institutions that have struggled to do that, then we need to reinvent those institutions. The system needs to be at a higher level, needs to be managing the various assets and institutions that we have to drive toward a better end result for more kids. So that means leveraging Mastery charter schools. That means leveraging the Catholic school system, which, on the question of efficient, does it for 1/3 the cost of what public schools do. It struggles to do it for all, it struggles to serve kids with special education needs in many respects because it only has $3,500 per pupil to work with, but it's doing incredible things for some kids at a very low price point. That should be part of the ecosystem. There's always going to be a day when kids are wanting to choose schools outside of the private system. And so if we're thinking about a system of thorough and efficient education, we need to be thinking about how to leverage all the assets, all the resources that we have. I would point out that this is what we do in higher education, and this is what we do in pre-kindergarten education. So cities that have gone to universal pre-K, it's not one institution doing all of the provision. It's a constellation of providers. School districts, one of those, but there are also lots of private providers who are providing pre-K services. In higher ed, we have private colleges, we have state colleges, we have quasi-public colleges, we have big colleges, we have small colleges. We use a constellation. In every other system, we use a constellation of provider model, and we're doing that too in K-12, but we're arguing about whether that's the right way to go. I would encourage us to accept what we have to work with and figure out how to drive what we have toward a better place, reinventing it, transforming it for the 21st century, but leveraging the assets that we have.
Donna?
I guess I would say two things. Maybe the Catholic system's doing really well. A lot of kids in my neighborhood go to Catholic school. I have no idea because they don't use the same assessments as we do. I really have very little information about how that typical neighborhood Catholic school is doing in comparison to their neighborhood schools or other schools in the city. I think it's a really good model for some families, and if they want to choose to do that, I don't begrudge them that at all. I'm just not sure we can currently. I hope that the Catholic school system will move to a common platform so we can say that about them. I'm not against saying that. I just want it to be proven. But I do think that in the pre-K world, one of the things that's the most exciting in the pre-K world is that Oklahoma is in fact not using a mixed provider model because they were a little nervous about the quality of that. And I have to say, it was actually a very conservative billionaire that drove the decision for Oklahoma to adopt universal pre-K and drove for it to happen through the schools because he didn't have faith in this deregulated environment. And I do think we have better quality control, as bad as it is, a little bit better in a quality environment. But What we do need to understand is that when we expand choice, unfortunately in Pennsylvania right now, we pay charter school tuition, we pay from a public school, a charter school, a tuition payment. And it is a guaranteed tuition payment. So the state forces the school district to pay that to the charter, and whether it can afford to educate its own students or not after that payment. So I do think if we think a mixed delivery system is going to work, there shouldn't be a financial valve that shuts off after that payment. Because then by virtue of the fact of choice, some kids are getting a higher value, dollar-wise, education compared to others because where they left from is being shortchanged. So the problem is the pie is not expanding to enable choice, or we haven't figured out the payment mechanism so there is an injury for students who choose to stay in the schools that they're in.
I agree that there's been the way the budget is set up at this point, you have phantom costs. What I disagree with is how we've managed those phantom costs as we've watched a school population in the last 15 years go from traditional public schools with a population of about 220 kids down to about 120,000. That's not going away. And that's been enough time that I would hope we did the hard work politically so that we can reallocate those funds and not have it hurt the remaining 120,000 kids in a traditional public school and have a win-win.
The money is the same number of kids. Remember, when a kid goes to charter, it's the same pool of money. So it just want everybody to be really clear. That was very...
And I agree with that, but as long as you keep the same buildings open, and you're serving far fewer kids, and you have a principal there, and you have a secretary maybe, you can, it's like with any business, it's unfortunately like the Inquirer, and I want you all to make sure she stays in her job. You have to look at a business model that's more efficient, and you know, Dr. Haidt needs support in that. That's a tough political world to navigate, but the reality is, you know, there are efficiencies that would free up dollars so that when they go to charter 15 years down the road and the roadmap has remained the same, we're not duplicating costs. In terms of choice and you know, the direction, I think that the only way, and there's no turning back the clock, that we're really going to have a strong delivery system that is focused forward in a competitive situation. And I come from a family that was fully educated with public schools. I believe in a very strong public system. But I don't think after 40 years of very mixed results, we're there and we're not getting there anytime soon. So we have to really look and insist on accountability. We have to have an open marketplace within the public system that really allows families within the city that don't have the economic choices some of us have to gain that access. And I think it's only through a vibrant landscape of all different kind of providers and then making that accountable. And I disagree that I don't think the public schools have been as accountable as they should to close schools that are not working, that haven't worked for decades, and to just keep moving forward, because that's the only thing we can do in life is move forward and serve children.
There's lots more we could say on this topic, but let's take some audience questions now. I'm going to package two together. One is, students at top-tier universities are much more likely to choose pre-med studies or investment banking over education majors. What are some ways to attract top talent that aren't Teach for America? And considering Mark's note that the pension plan may not be attractive to or useful for recruiting and retaining young teachers, how do we recruit and retain younger teachers, even if they only teach for a few years? Anyone jump in there?
I'll go first on that. So I think we need to completely rethink the whole compensation structure for teachers at the state level and at the district level. So not just pensions, but benefits and salaries and raises. We need a more innovative compensation structure. And ultimately, we need to pay teachers more, but you know, it's hard to just dump a whole bunch of new tax money into that. So we have to create a structure that we can evolve toward that. We also, there's some really interesting, you know, at the end of the day, what attracts people to work somewhere and to stay working there is the quality of the experience of the work. You know, Is it a collaborative environment? Are you trusted by your colleagues? Do you feel empowered to do important work? We need to work harder on that piece of it as well. There are some really interesting experiments going on in places around the country around creating new cultures within schools that give teachers more leadership over how the school is run day to day. I think we need to be investing in those kinds of approaches. We need to focus on compensation, but also on the conditions that teachers work in. And we need to be learning to leverage teachers more. We have a traditional command and control structure in most schools. Principal makes the decisions, teachers teach. We need to do more leveraging the experience of teachers to be part of the leadership team of schools, so they're part of the decision making, they're part of the innovation setting work that needs to happen in schools.
I'm told we are running short on time, so I'll take one more response. Who wants to jump in?
I would say very quickly that if we want to attract good teachers to the field, I agree the number one driver for anybody to choose a field typically is pay. So we got to deal with that one. Ohio did a massive increase in their starting teacher salaries, driven by Republican business people who are worried about the state of public education. But I would also say we need superintendents across the state, across the country, who will hold principals accountable and make sure they're really good managers. If you want a great building, your principal has to be great, and that's what's going to keep teachers in the schools. And so many people leave the field of education because they can't figure out how to break through on bad management. So we have to increase the salary, but we also have to get better at managing this massive public institution.
Well, thank you, panel, for your time. Thank you, audience, for your questions. Sorry we couldn't get more. And I'm told to encourage you all to stick close. There's going to be a very quick set change, and then I'll be back to talk about the state of public education with Dr. William Haidt. So stay where you are. We'll be back in a few minutes.